The conspirators thought they had saved the Roman Republic. They had plunged their daggers into Julius Caesar, convinced his death would restore senatorial rule and end tyranny. But within moments, it became clear that they had set something far more dangerous into motion. Instead of restoring order, they had unleashed chaos, one that would tear Rome apart and lead to the rise of an emperor even more powerful than Caesar himself. Panic erupted in the Senate chamber as blood pooled around Caesar's body. Some senators, still clutching their togas, fled in terror, fearing they might be next. Outside, the people of Rome stood in stunned silence. Caesar, their hero, their supposed god, lay dead on the Senate floor. What would happen next? Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally, knew he was in immediate danger. The conspirators had spared him, but he wasn't about to wait and see if they changed their minds. Disguising himself as a slave, he slipped through the streets and barricaded himself inside his house. Meanwhile, the assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, rushed to the Capitoline Hill, expecting to be hailed as liberators. Instead, the city held its breath. Would Rome accept their vision of a republic reborn? Or was a reckoning coming? Word spread quickly, and tensions soared. Caesar's loyal soldiers, still stationed across the city, awaited orders. Some urged revenge, others hesitated. The people were restless, unsure if they should mourn or celebrate. Then came an ominous move. Lepidus, one of Caesar's top commanders, began rallying troops. His loyalty to Caesar was absolute, and he wanted vengeance. But rather than strike immediately, he waited, watching, calculating his next move. Brutus and Cassius realized they had underestimated the power of public perception. They had expected Rome to rejoice, but instead, they found themselves trapped, forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. Their hopes now rested on Dolabella, the man Caesar had named as consul. At first, he seemed to side with them, offering political support. But could they trust him? Or was he simply biding his time? The Senate was in turmoil. Some saw the conspirators as heroes, others as traitors. Mark Antony, now regaining his composure, made a chilling argument. If they rejected Caesar's rule, then every law, every appointment, and every act under his name would be undone. That included their own positions of power. The senators, unwilling to risk political chaos, hesitated. Cicero, the legendary orator, proposed a desperate compromise. Caesar's decisions would be honored, but his killers would be spared. It was an uneasy truce, but it kept Rome from immediate war. Yet Antony had one more move: Caesar's funeral. It was no ordinary funeral. It was a spectacle, a masterstroke of political theater. Antony knew the people still loved Caesar, and he would use that love to his advantage. Standing before a massive crowd, he held up Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing to each wound, each betrayal. The people watched in horror. This was no mere assassination, it was butchery. Then came the final shock. Caesar's will was read, revealing that his fortune and name would pass to a single heir, his great-nephew, a mere 19-year-old named Octavian. The people gasped. Caesar had left them money as well, a direct insult to the Senate and a reminder of his generosity. The crowd's grief turned to fury. The city erupted. A riot broke out as enraged citizens hunted down anyone suspected of being involved in Caesar's murder. In the chaos, they seized a man named Cinna, mistaking him for one of the conspirators. He was innocent, but that didn't matter. He was torn apart by the mob, a symbol of the storm that had been unleashed. Antony watched as Rome burned. For a moment, it seemed as though he had lost control. The people were too enraged, too unpredictable. But he soon found a way to turn the crisis to his advantage. He executed a radical agitator, proving to the Senate that he could control the masses when necessary. His influence grew, but Antony wasn't the only one with a claim to power. Across the sea, a young man prepared to make his move. Octavian, the heir named in Caesar's will, arrived in Italy. He was young, unproven, and underestimated by almost everyone. But he had something no one else did, the name of Caesar, and he intended to use it. At just 19 years old, Octavian had no military experience, no powerful allies, and no direct path to power. Yet, he carried the weight of his great-uncle's legacy. Rome was in chaos, split between Antony, the Senate, and the conspirators. But Octavian saw an opportunity. He didn't need an army, at least not yet. What he needed was loyalty, and he knew exactly where to find it. Caesar's veterans, battle-hardened warriors who had followed their general through Gaul, Egypt, and beyond, were still in Italy. Many had been promised land and rewards that only Caesar could grant. But now Caesar was dead, and the man holding his fortune was Antony. Octavian wasted no time. He traveled across Italy, meeting with these veterans one by one. He invoked Caesar's name, reminded them of their fallen leader's promises, and positioned himself as the rightful heir. His message was simple. Antony had stolen their rewards, but Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar, would restore them. The gamble worked. Soldiers who had fought for Caesar now pledged their allegiance to his heir. Slowly, Octavian built an army, not through force but through persuasion. He had no military victories, but he had something just as powerful: the loyalty of the men who had won those victories. Meanwhile, in Rome, Antony was tightening his grip. He controlled the Senate, the treasury, and the loyalty of many powerful figures. But he had made enemies. His growing arrogance alienated key senators, including Cicero, who saw Antony as an even greater threat to the Republic than Caesar had ever been. Cicero, always the master strategist, saw an opportunity in Octavian. To him, the young man was nothing more than a pawn, someone who could be used to challenge Antony's dominance. He reached out to Octavian, offering political legitimacy in exchange for an alliance against Antony. For Octavian, this was a perfect chance to strike. With Senate support, he now had the one thing he still lacked: recognition. He marched his growing army toward Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Antony, now facing opposition from both the Senate and Octavian's forces, had no choice. He fled, rallying his own army to prepare for war. The battle lines were drawn. The Republic was now split between two factions: Antony, who commanded Caesar's loyalists, and Octavian, the unexpected challenger carrying Caesar's name. The Senate, hoping to maintain some control, sided with Octavian. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. Octavian wasn't just a pawn. He wasn't a tool to be used against Antony. He had his own ambitions, his own vision for Rome, and he would not be controlled. The war between Octavian and Antony was brutal, but Octavian had something Antony didn't: public support. The people still mourned Caesar, and Octavian positioned himself as the avenger of his great uncle. He played the role perfectly, painting Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Caesar's legacy for his own greed. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Mutina. Octavian, with the Senate's backing, defeated Antony's forces. It was a stunning victory, one that cemented his place as a true political force. Antony, weakened but not defeated, fled to the east to regroup. With Antony gone, the Senate expected Octavian to step aside, but they had underestimated him once again. Instead of relinquishing his power, Octavian turned his army on Rome itself, forcing the Senate to recognize him as consul. He was no longer a mere heir. He was now one of the most powerful men in Rome. But the battle for control was far from over. Antony, now in the east, had formed an alliance with Lepidus, another powerful general. Together, they commanded vast resources and legions. A new civil war seemed inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of fighting, Octavian proposed a shocking alliance. He would join forces with Antony and Lepidus, forming a triumvirate, a three-man rule over Rome. It was a temporary truce, a way to eliminate their common enemies before turning on each other. Their first target? The conspirators who had killed Caesar. Brutus, Cassius, and the others had fled Rome, believing they were safe. They were wrong. The triumvirate declared them enemies of the state, launching a campaign of brutal vengeance. What followed was one of the bloodiest purges in Roman history. Proscriptions were issued, lists of names marked for execution. Political enemies, wealthy elites, and even former allies were hunted down and killed. Some were executed publicly. Others were forced to take their own lives. Their wealth was confiscated, their families destroyed. Cicero, the great orator who had once backed Octavian against Antony, found himself on one of those lists. Octavian, who had once needed Cicero's support, no longer did. As Antony's men closed in, Cicero tried to escape. But there was no mercy. His head and hands were cut off and displayed in the forum as a warning. The message was clear: no one was safe. Meanwhile, the war against Caesar's assassins reached its climax. In 42 BCE, at the Battle of Philippi, Brutus and Cassius faced the combined forces of Antony and Octavian. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, their forces collapsed. Cassius, seeing defeat was inevitable, fell on his own sword. Brutus held out longer, but in the end, he too took his own life. The last defenders of the Republic were dead. The Republic itself was now only a memory. The real question was no longer whether Rome would have a ruler, but which man would claim the throne. Octavian and Antony had eliminated their enemies, but they both knew that sooner or later, they would have to face each other. The battle for Rome was not over. It had only just begun.